establishment, we have been actively participating in the initiatives strengthening scientific cooperation in Europe. The Bulgarian Academy of Sciences welcomes the creation of the consortium under SAPEA project and has already expressed its readiness to actively collaborate to the provision of scientific expertise for policy advice. The SAPEA project is very important indeed. It responds to the requirements to improve the quality of European Union policy making by providing timely scientific evidence to the European Commission's scientific advice mechanism, thereby increasing the transparency and public confidence of the European Union policy making. Actively bringing the knowledge of academies into the policy making process is thus only a logical development and highlights the importance of academies for the European science landscape. A new model of interaction between science and policy in Europe is increasingly necessary. Scientific opinions on the most serious problems, including on hot topics asked by politicians, is regularly prepared. We have to work towards a change in the policymakers' attitudes for more collaboration with scientists in the policy-making process. Let me just mention that an important forthcoming issue to be addressed is to better shape the framework Program 9, in particular by assuring equal participation of European Union member states in the framework program for science and innovation. I think that we all are convinced completely that supporting talent all over Europe is of vital importance for Europe's future. I very much hope that the exchange of ideas, experience, and good practices today will become a solid basis for a more effective partnership between scientists and decision makers. I wish you success of today's meeting.
Dear Professor Rewalski, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to be here today again and to say several words about the advisory mechanism, which is, I guess, extremely important for both sets of politicians and sets of scientists. It's important to be efficient in training politicians, to educating them, and it's also very crucial to be able to do the best which is possible to work together with politicians. Of course, one should take into account that scientists and politicians are solving different optimization problems. So the main goal of us, of politicians, is to make European citizens and citizens happy in order to be re-elected in 4 years. At the same time, scientists have another agenda. So it will be very good to work together to find a correct measure, correct metrics to do this job. Of course, it's extremely important to be able to predict some hazards, say. You may know that in January 2017, here in this country, in Bulgaria, we had very, very heavy snowfall. So our scientists, especially from the Academy of Sciences, did a very good job. They used to run the Eulerian model to predict very carefully using the supercomputer Ave2Hol, which is installed here in Sofia, with a very fine resolution, just 300 meters, to predict which part of the highway from Sofia to to Burgas should be closed. And this just showed how powerful is the scientific advice to politicians. At the same time, of course, we need to look for metrics to measure the happiness of citizens. And I was surprised to learn that there is such a measure. It is some research is done by Raj in his famous book, which appeared just one year ago. So let's work together. Let's try to formulate unified optimization problem, and let's try to help politicians to be more efficient. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Rivalski, Professor Dimov, for this warm welcome, for hosting us here in Bulgaria, and for being such great hosts, really. My name is Julia Stamm. I have the pleasure of guiding you through the day. I'm a science policy consultant based in Berlin, and I will try to make sure that everything runs smoothly, that our speakers get the attention they deserve, and we also try to make sure not to go over time too much. As you've seen, we have a very, very dense agenda, and so we need to be very strict with time. We also want this discussion to be a very practical one, not too theoretic, and for that we rely very much on your active engagement. So please ask your questions, we will have the microphones in the room, and look forward to exchanging with you. Without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Charpentier and Professor Dykstra to join me here on the stage and to provide us with the framework for today's discussion. Allow me to introduce very briefly Professor Charpentier. Professor Charpentier is the chair of SAPEA since December last year and also president of FEAM, the Federation of the European Academies of Medicine. He is honorary dean of the Faculty of Medicine of Paris Sud 11 and a fellow of the French Academy of Medicine. Bernard, the floor is yours.
This is a very small technical problem, but Laura will solve it. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome you today to the SAPEA conference as part of the ALLEA 2018 General Assembly. Our event is entitled Shaping European Science Advice, Insights and Experiences. We are very grateful to the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences for hosting the event today. Thank you, Professor Rivalski, for your hospitality, and ALLEA for organizing this assembly. And thanks so much to Professor Ivan Dimov for this talk about science and education in Bulgaria. Both are the two pillars of a great nation. Throughout this morning, you will hear more about the SAPEA, Science Advice for Policy by European Academies. It has been my pleasure to chair the SAPEA board since the end of 2017, after the mandate of my good friend Gunther Stott, which is at the first row. In this exciting project, we bring together the perspectives of more than 100 academies into the European Science Advice Mechanism. SAPEA's creation at the end of 2016 and our ongoing collaboration with the European Commission Group of Chief Scientific Advisors, GCSA, formerly HLG, because I'm old, so I'm just coming back to HLG, are important steps in ensuring transparency in science advice. and for science to play a significant role in advising politicians and proposing options for policies. Thank you also to all the people working so hard in SAPEA, in SAM, in GCSA for building up the Europe of science and innovation, sustaining competition with the two giants, US and China. This is the reason why we need the help of every nation of Europe, big or small. There is no big or small science. There is only one good science. In the session that followed, we will explore the scientific advice for policy making with perspectives from different countries. You find it across Europe and beyond. We will then delve into SAPEA's work so far, using two case studies to explore the opportunities and challenges that emerge from providing scientific advice in this way. Today's conference will then offer an opportunity for academies to reflect on the discussions, providing their valuable insights on the process. The interdisciplinary of SAPEA would be of paramount importance. I would like to offer first some brief thoughts on the three aspects of SAPEA that I personally feel are very important in our success. The first of these is the interdisciplinary. I will provide a few examples of topics of advice that we have worked so far and we have examined. How to systematically gain more food from the oceans. I will just recall that in Europe we have 6 seas, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, US only 2, and China 1. How plant protection products should be regulated, the latest thinking of cybersecurity, the climate change mitigation potential of carbon capture technologies. For all those topics, and indeed for all policy topics, the questions cannot be answered with the knowledge for just one discipline. By combining knowledge from engineering, mathematics, Professor Rigolfi, humanities, medicine, natural sciences, and social sciences academies, SAPEA takes an interdisciplinary approach to these topics. You can see on the screen behind me, it's maybe impossible to show you the slide, but how SAPEA is formed to the consortium of European academies networks that cover this wide range of disciplines. I think this interdisciplinary is very important in our approach. The combination of different disciplines will also be essential in our next major topic, transforming the future aging. Europe is the oldest continent compared to Asia, Africa, South America, but aging doesn't mean inertia or idiocy. I would like to highlight geographical spread. Later this morning, we will hear about the advice systems in different parts of Europe, in South Africa. We will see that advice is developed and taken up differently by different countries. The need for a broad range of geographical perspectives is represented within SAPEA itself. It is also represented in our group of experts. SAPEA is also aiming for geographical spread when we disseminate our findings. We have been working with academies to develop public engagement events, and we have so far showcased our work in UK, Norway, Germany, Estonia, Slovenia, and the Netherlands, with events to follow soon in Portugal, Romania, and Sweden. I hope there will be scope to work with academies further in our public engagement activities over the coming years. And finally, but very importantly, I would like to highlight the need for SAPEA collaboration with others in the scientific community, within the network's member academies, with stakeholders for each topic, and the group of chief scientific advisors. This has been essential for the process of providing scientific advice to the Commission, and has ensured our success so far. I look forward to this continued warm and very positive collaboration. Pearl. It's my pleasure now to introduce Professor Pearl Dykstra, my own Pearl, who will explain more about the work and formation of the group of chief scientific advisors. I might just say that they regain now the Holy Kabbalistic number 7 in the Bible, because Nicole Grobert from Oxford University, and starting from Ulm, and who is a very kind expert, will work with us, was recently nominated. I look forward to the interesting discussion that will follow, and I thank everyone for attending today. Thank you so much indeed for your attention. And I am sorry for the slide. It's a technical failure, the digital world.
Thanks very much, Bernard, and also for coping with the technology issues. It's always a surprise when things don't work the way they should. Bernard, from your talk, I already take away a number of things, among others. So I would like to retain your idea that there is no big or small science, but only one science. You also take away the notion of the importance of interdisciplinarity for all policy topics. And finally, also the need for science to reach out and to engage with the stakeholders, with others. And I think these are three topics that will probably accompany us during the day. I'd now like to introduce very briefly Professor Pearl Dykstra. Pearl is the Deputy Chair of the European Commission's Group of Chief Scientific Advisors. She has a chair in empirical sociology and is a director of research of the Department of Public Administration and Sociology at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. And her work mainly focuses on intergenerational solidarity, family change, and aging societies. So, Pearl, the floor is yours. And this time, technology is with it.
Good morning. Good morning, Deputy Minister. Good morning, President of the Bulgarian Academy. Good morning to all of you. It's a privilege to be here to introduce SAM. Yes, in Brussels, one loves acronyms. SAM is the Scientific Advice Mechanism. And Bernard, fortunately, I do have slides because what I have has not been written out. But I can complement what you had to say. If I can move them, yes. I'm getting there. Okay. The scientific advice mechanism was established in the fall of 2015, and it's an umbrella. It's an umbrella which includes SAPEA, Scientific Advice for Policy by the European Academies, it's a wonderful collaboration because this way we as chief scientific advisors can rely on the best knowledge in Europe, all over Europe and all disciplines. And I would also like to acknowledge that there's a scientific secretariat in Brussels, a group of about 20 excellent academics. Some of them are full professors, led by Johannes Klumpers, who's here in the first row, and who will be speaking to us later. Who are we? Well, yes, as Bernard said, we are now 7. And please look, you will see that we're now 4 women and 3 men. Look also that when I started, I was the only social scientist, but now there are 2 social scientists. I will take you through the pictures and the names. From the top left, he was nominated by the Young Academy, so that's wonderful too, that we're not just a set of gerontocracies, but we also represent the young of the academies in Europe. Janusz Bojnicki, Polish, and he's a biologist, a bioinformatician at the University of Warsaw. Then the second from the right is Elvira Fortunato. She's a materials engineer, and she's at the University of Lisbon. Then, top right is our new star, Professor Nicole Grobert, German, English, and she's at the University of Oxford, a specialist in nanotechnology. Bottom left is Rolf Heuer, particles physicist and former director of CERN, and he's the chair of us 7 chief scientific advisors. In the middle is, at the bottom, is Karina Keskitalo. She's a political scientist specializing on environmental issues. She's at the University of Umeå in Sweden. And at the bottom right is Paul Nurse, a biologist, director of the Francis Crick Institute in London, and as you all know, a Nobel Prize winner. It's very important for our status not only in Brussels, but all over Europe and the rest of the world, that we show that we are not only the best of science, but that we are characterized by integrity. Yesterday, José van Dijk described the principles that contribute to trust in science: independence, transparency, autonomy. And so if there's any conflict of interest between our positions and what we are working on, we are open about it. We're also fully open about what evidence we have used. So people who visit our website can see what topics we're working on, how we're working on them, what publications we have used, and the kinds of evidence. And what we've learned throughout the process is evidence is not necessarily always already published. Some of our topics are so new that we rely on expert advice, which we gain through workshops. On the one hand, we are responsive to requests from the European Commission. And here are examples of 6 opinions, that's what we call them, scientific opinions, which we have delivered to the European Commission. One is on CO2 emissions, the difference between what was happening in the laboratory and what was happening on the road. Report on cybersecurity, report or a scientific opinion on, this was what we called an explanatory note, because what we used here was to provide the state of art of science, and this was on new breeding techniques. The report, Food from the Oceans, the scientific opinion, will return in a later session. As we speak, the scientific opinion on plant production products is at the printer, so that will be coming out in early June. And in preparation is another scientific opinion, which came from our very first one, and that's novel carbon capture and utilization technologies. I can assure you that our work has been making an impact, and that is one of the tasks that the Secretariat has taken upon itself, to trace where our work is being used, in what regulation, and whether it's in Europe, the national level, or the local levels. We are also proactive. We're developing our own topics. Bernard, this is a topic developed by, where SAPEA is taking the initiative on the future of aging societies. Another topic which is of great interest to the policymakers is, the working title is Making Sense of Science Under Conditions of Complexity and Uncertainty. And here we hope to end up with a scientific opinion that will help policymakers understand or make sense of the complexities that science has. When science disagrees, when science has evolved so that earlier views have changed, or when science runs into problems of poor replicability or biases. These are problems which are almost inherent to the scientific process, but can be very confusing not only to citizens but to policymakers, and we are going to try to help them through these issues. So, what's the bigger picture? There's the 7 of us. We provide scientific advice to the European Commission. The European Commission uses it in its regulation. Those regulations are discussed in the European Parliament. Their regulations are discussed but also adopted at the national level. And in the end, and this is something that one of the speakers said, our goal is to make a better society for our European citizens. Thank you.
Carol, also a big thanks to you, also for your last words on what science is actually supposed to do, and to me in particular in the context of SAM. I take away again the notion of interdisciplinarity, also in the composition of your group of advisors, and the importance of scientific integrity, transparency, and ethics. And before moving on to the next speaker, I would like to give you a quote by Rex Tillerson. You might remember the former US Secretary of State. And he said yesterday that the American democracy was threatened by a growing crisis of ethics and integrity. And I'm reading this out because I think it's interesting in the context of our discussion today. And so he said, if our leaders seek to conceal the truth, or we as people become accepting of alternative realities that are no longer grounded in facts, then we as citizens are on a pathway to relinquishing our freedom. And I think this is very interesting in the context of our discussion, in the context of how to provide actually science advice to policymakers. Maybe we can reflect on this in the course of today. I now like to invite Karina Angelieva to join me here on the stage. She will be our opening presenter. She will give the keynote for today on how to develop scientific-based policies, future policies for sustainability and growth based on research data and analysis. And Karina, if you allow me, I'll just introduce you very quickly. So you are the counselor and head of the sector education and research at the permanent representation of Bulgaria to the European Union. Europe, if I may say so, has been a key issue for her since her studies in European integration and contemporary history here in Sofia. Karina is also a founder of the Club of Young Scientists in Bulgaria and has for 10 years coordinated the network for national contact points for the European Framework Programme. Karina will speak for approximately 10 to 15 minutes. We will not allow any questions after her presentation, but she will join the panel after that, so you can grill her later on. Please, Karina.
Thank you. We give very strict rules. This is how we like it. Good morning, honorable guests. Good morning, the president of the both academies. Dear colleagues and friends, I'm also using this expression because I was working at the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences for around 3 years, and this was extremely enriching period of my professional development. Moreover, I'm very excited today because for the first time I was speaking here on this stage, I think in 2001, when most of my friends nowadays from the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences was wondering what exactly I can say from the point of view that I was just graduated. But anyhow, some years later, I'm here today again, and I'm really very much honored to open this first session and to talk about evidence-based policy. This is an extremely important topic again nowadays, but it is not new. This is what I want to stress. In fact, there are many developments on the European level, and concerning the developments that the new Commission, especially investing in the SAM mechanism, but we also should remember that already in 2011 we had a chief scientific advisor to the President of the Commission, which really showcased and gave a strong signal to all the member states that we have to invest more efforts in policy based on strong scientific evidence. There are, of course, many aspects that you touch upon today. I wanted to make it simple and exactly to talk about what is the role of the academies, what is the role of the national academies and of ALLEA, and what is the potential for their growing role and interference in the whole cycle of evidence-based policy making. In principle, it's not an easy or there is no one model that can be applied, but for sure there are several aspects that it will be nice to discuss today. One of them is that we need, and I agree with previous speakers before me, that we also need to make the policy more efficient and the politicians more efficient. But in fact, what we very often see nowadays is that there is a constant pressure on the researchers to try to reach or to find the politicians, to persuade them that they are doing something right or wrong, or they can do something better. Very often we are in a position, we meaning from the point of view of the researchers, to try to find open doors so that our voice is heard. And I believe that this is not the way how we are going to do efficient policy making. In fact, there should be another model where the politicians make their decisions or take important decisions before that they consult researchers. There already we see very good instruments like SAM mechanism, which can be replicated to national level. But what is the problem, in fact, to realize this, if it's so easy just to call politicians, advise before that scientists, and then everything is fine? Of course, it's not so simple. Of course, there is first competition among researchers. Secondly, in order these mechanisms to work, we need really a quality and excellent science, so that the politicians can also more persuasively make their decisions. On the other hand, it's not so easy because we have to understand the politicians. Very often they don't react or they don't take decisions because of evidence or because they did a very thoughtful impact assessment. Very often they take decisions from political manner, they take emotional decisions, they take decisions because there is a demand from society on something important also, of course, for the policy cycle. The other problem with the politicians and the researchers is that, in fact, the research, and I think this is the core and the most important, what we have always to remind the politicians, the research per se is the knowledge base of the whole society. And we can't expect the research to work in a policy cycle as the politicians for 3-4 years to produce something that is used and then is not anymore. But the politicians, they work in a policy cycle. They're in a hurry and they want to show results. This is the other problem, in fact. My deputy minister today showcased some positive examples and for evidence policy making for decisions where politicians need the science results. But these are very often emergency situations with a high sensitivity for the society, where of course the politicians then need the researchers in order to prove their decisions, or how to say, to explain a problem, which is very often of course linked to the security of the citizens or environmental issues. So in my perspective, also working in the council, where we are supposed to advise our politicians to take decisions for the development of science, I believe that we also need to create better networks so that our own capacity is enriched on every daily basis with scientific evidence, because more and more what we are working, and this is another aspect I wanted to touch upon today, is quite much interdisciplinary. We know this, of course, but we need somehow to combine knowledge more and more from different sectors. And when we are talking for policy and politicians, and this morning I was thinking, yes, but in fact policy and politicians can't work without governments, without administration. So this is another point which I don't know if you discussed and you develop something to SAPEA, but I think this is a very fruitful area when we can collaborate more, because in fact the administration stays. The administration, the bodies stays after the policy cycles, and more we see that we have a lack of expertise, a lack of knowledge, concrete knowledge in different administrations, so that to feed different policies from agriculture and energy to cybersecurity or defense. We now don't discuss which thought was this to inject into the administration young graduates who graduated political sciences, but never touch upon or get acquainted with important topics, for example, concerning genomics or other areas. So I believe that a huge role of the academies and especially of the national academies, and there are already a very good examples in this area, is the education. We can't educate the politicians, but we have to educate, and we can train the young generation of researchers and the young generation of administration and politicians. But I don't want to simplify it so much. In fact, I wanted to share with you that this is a lifelong learning process. And in fact, the demand for the knowledge which the researchers are producing is growing, because in fact the environment is becoming more complicated, and people can't that are working in specific industries, in specific politics, they need urgently this knowledge. And here is, of course, one aspect that I'm very happy to share also with you today, that during the Bulgarian presidencies we worked a lot on it, and we can congratulate with the good results, as on 29th of May we expect the ministers to adopt a council conclusions on circulation of knowledge transfer. One of the main aspects we touch upon at the council, and we developed specific recommendations to the member states, is the access to research results. We discuss a lot before we start this presidency of the Council of the European Union with our researchers. We make analysis also on national level, but also we discuss with other member states, and in fact we discovered that we have fantastic research results funded through the framework program or funded through the national funds, but we don't have the necessary access to these research results that are already there from years, which also can enrich the knowledge not only of the politicians. And here's another aspect. I don't want to repeat what the honorable guests before me said, but we won't succeed in this exercise if, of course, the stakeholders, the civil society, but also the industries also are not acquainted and get more understanding of how should work and how we should plan our work, our jobs and our policies ahead. I recently was in the European Parliament in a debate where I have to share with you that there were fantastic young Bulgarians with some very successful companies that are now selling for thousands of money, and this is what very often we want from research. Okay, why you're not developing immediately startups, why you don't turn your results into a growing demand and knowledge and jobs. Wonderful of these young people. I afterwards asked them, are you collaborating with research, or what did you graduate, what are your next steps? The answer of one of these young men was, why I should need? I was so clever to invent this that now I have some next ideas. And I said, wow, this is very interesting. How you get the data for these ideas? How then you scale up your business? Who will give you the data, for example, that we are gathering in different areas? You should contact the university, or you should contact the Academy of Sciences. And I didn't thought about this because we have Google, no? Oh, no, I said, but anyhow, I see, and I don't want to stop your dreams, but okay, I'm showing this because very often we have failures of also of the young generation of innovators, because they are also not acquainted, they are not diving deep into the knowledge which they need constantly in order to develop their businesses. The same we were discussing today for the policymakers. But I don't want, of course, to praise only the, how to say, my friends from the research sectors, and to say that they are doing only excellent, they shouldn't do anything, and the others should understand them. I mean, at the end of the day, we also should recognize that the researchers has also the responsibility, of course, to share what they are doing. I mean, if they expect that their research per se have to be understood and have to be taken on board, of course, this is not how exactly is working. And this is another pressure for the researchers, and especially from the managers of the research institutions nowadays, because the demand for communicating skills, the demand for open access to the research work, to research data also is growing, which demands different skills, different combination of infrastructure, of environment, and last but not least, of course, it demands a lot of time to be realized. These things don't happen from one year to another. But I believe that this is the way forward, and indeed, as representative of Bulgaria at the Council, I can't say anything bad but good for what is happening on the European level. We have the SAM mechanism, which can be really boosted ahead. We also have the Joint Research Center, but more is necessary, because we shouldn't go on like this, dragging science desperately to be heard from the politicians or to be used. It should be on an equal level, so to speak. And I'm positive that this will happen with people and with the knowledge we already have in the academies like you. So I wish also fruitful discussions today, and thank you very much once again for the invitation.
Yes, Karina, thanks very much. And as I promised, she will join our panel. Also in your talk, Karina, you have already made a number of very, very interesting and inspiring statements. Just want to remind you of very few of them. So there is the importance to understand the context in which policies are being made, like the policy cycle versus the science cycle. The importance of collaboration, and cooperation was highlighted not only between disciplines, but also between different sectors, between different administrations, but also with civil society and industry. You also mentioned the importance of education of scientists, of the next generation of scientists. And you also highlighted the relevance of understanding, trying to understand each other, and I find this notion of understanding to be a crucial one. And finally, you pointed out the aspect of time, and then we shouldn't rush things and expect things to happen within the next minute or so, and we need a long breath for things to really work in the way we want. Okay, I'd now like to invite my first panel, Professor Peter Halligan, Professor Franz Broms, and Dr. Sofia Bolani. And you see, I don't manage, I'm very sorry, so I just call you Sia. He has allowed me to do that. So, Peter, Franz, and Sia, please join me here. Our first panel will be dealing with several national perspectives on science for policy, and we have our eminent speakers who will do this from different perspectives. They will give a short input of 8 to 10 minutes maximum, and then we'll open for the discussion with you. I would like to start by introducing Professor Peter Halligan. He is the third Chief Scientific Advisor for Wales, a position he took up very recently in March 2018. Prior to this, he was the Chief Executive of the Learned Society of Wales. Before that, until 2014, he was Chair and Academic Lead of the Welsh Crucible, a flagship leadership program for early career researchers, and we might come back to the notion of education here. His research background is in neuropsychology, neuropsychiatry, and neurorehabilitation, and the title of his talk today will be Science Advice for Government Policy, a Rough Guide. The floor is yours, Peter. Yes, try that. I'm looking for Laura. This one? Okay, then it's easy.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to present at this conference today. What I'm going to tell you about very briefly today as the remit, the exam question that Julia set us, was basically look at those aspects of science-based policy in different contexts, and I'm going to talk from different perspectives, particularly with regard to the UK. I'm also going to offer some practical suggestions from some of the initial thoughts I have from colleagues who are already working in these positions within the United Kingdom. The first slide I have up here, just to remind people where Wales is located on the left-hand side. But back in 2004, in the Eurostat yearbook, they unfortunately seem to have neglected us somewhat. Anyway, small country, but at the same time, definitely on the map. So, multiple perspectives. Basically, as Julia pointed out, the last time I presented here was in 2016, very briefly, when we joined, the Learned Society of Wales joined the ALLEA family. And I've been in that position as Chief Executive for about 3 years. And in that capacity, like other national academies, we were providing a source of independent, authoritative scholarly advice to government and other sources on matters that affected Wales. It's a very relatively new society, following on in the steps of much more prestigious and older societies. But in March of this year, I moved across into the position working for Welsh Government as Chief Scientific Advisor. And the remit of that is to provide and review scientific advice provided to government, to work with the UK Chief Scientific Advisors Group, and to champion the role of science, and to provide independent advice, scrutiny and challenge to the Welsh Government. So in my brief discussion this morning, I'm going to cover 4 points: science advice to government, science for policy and policy for science, influencing policy, some little insights that I have with regard to my experience in Wales, and some practical observations derived from other colleagues on the basis of their experience. So, in terms of looking at the ecosystem that's out there with regard to science advice, there are different models reflecting different political cultures. The one I'm familiar with for the most part is the one starting on the left-hand side, and it goes back to 1957, I think, when there was a first US presidential science advisor, followed several years later in the United Kingdom. But it's true of other countries like Australia, India, Ireland, and so forth. A variety of those particular countries have chief scientific advisors which report to government. The second structure is the advisory councils, and the chief scientific advisors often utilize science advisory councils, and these again are one step further independent with regard to the relationship with government. Thirdly, we have the various national academies, which in the United Kingdom are very strong in promoting science and bringing issues to bear with regard to government. The 4 national UK societies, the Royal Society of British Academy, Royal Academy of Engineering, Academy of Medical Sciences, are very established, but also, as are the ones in Scotland now, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and more recently the Learned Society of Wales. And then we have a fourth component, the supernatural SAPEA, which we've heard about, which is a very interesting alternative model with regard to providing science advice. The UK government one, which I sit within to some extent, the government chief scientific advisor sits at the centre of this and reports directly to the Prime Minister. The chief scientific advisor is supported by a large group of Go Science, which is about 90 individuals, which provide a lot of the background support with regard to that individual. But that individual also has a dotted line to government departments. And in the United Kingdom government, there are about 20 different departments of which feed into the GCSA. But in terms of the structure, if you're starting from the left-hand side, moves from the government chief scientific advisor to the departmental chief scientific advisors, to the devolved nations as well, to the government science and engineering members, which are basically within the civil service, to the science advisory council and various committees, and then into a variety of outside bodies, including the national academies. The UK has a whole variety of chief scientific advisors in these different departments covering health, the Ministry of Defence, Environment, and the Foreign Commonwealth Office and Security. And we meet on a regular basis. The advice that has been given to me in my early stages with regard to learning about this role is that the Government Office for Science really only get involved when the outcomes at stake must be quite large, that science must be a significant factor in contributing and determining the outcomes, and if it can be done by someone else or some better qualified groupings, it should be. So in practical terms, and that was one of the remits of this session this morning, it's in practical terms, they prioritize in terms of its important novelty, the urgency, the timing aspect as we've already heard, and the longer term implications for science in relation to policy. Science for policy and policy for science, it's often the case that in some CSA systems, the advisors combine the responsibility to use the scientific evidence in policy making with a role in determining the budgets and the structure of research. In the UK, these roles, for the most part, are distinct, largely to avoid being seen primarily as an advocate for resources for science. Having said that, it's hugely important that the science advisors are involved in supporting the capacity for science, otherwise it'll undermine the contribution to economic and societal impact that it is to be derived there. In Wales, let me give you some little practical examples of my own. So the first chief scientific advisor, John Harries, began his work, he was started in 2010. In 2012, he developed a Welsh Government vision to build a strong and dynamic science base that supports the economic and national development of Wales. And the great thing that John secured for Wales, and this is more under maybe policy for science, was the idea of an initiative called Sir Cymru, Star Wales, which was based on the idea that they secured money from government to set up 5 international chair appointments and a whole host of funding for postdoctoral researchers and PhD students. And this was spread across the whole geography of Wales. Later on, the second chief scientific advisor, Julie Williams, was to some extent influenced by work that I did myself when I was in the Learned Society of Wales. I published a report that argued for the case that Wales needed more research capacity in the area of STEM. And that particular report was taken on board and actually resulted in the securing of about 65 million by the Welsh Government to develop Sir Cymru 2, which brought in about 130 different researchers from all parts of the world, including some of these countries here, including Bulgaria. The other aspect that when I was chief executive of the Learned Society, again working across the idea of how one can perhaps influence, is the idea of putting together documents of a nature that actually would persuade government to both use and take heed of. And we did a variety of these, including one in science back in 2016, but also the latter one on the right-hand side, Wales in the World, was a document we put together, which again now the Welsh Government use on trade missions and so forth. It's an opportunity to combine and convene the actual intellectual vitality of Wales in a way that the Welsh Government could actually make use of that. So some practical observations on science advice that I've derived from colleagues for the most part, because it's still early days in terms of my role. Some advice will be ignored. After all, it's only advice. Expect to inform policy, but not make it. CSAs do not make decisions. It's much better, as Peter Gluckman argues, to act as a broker, not an advocate, and this derives the earning of trust we talked about yesterday. It's important to maintain the scientific credibility with politicians and scientists, and it's also, as pointed out yesterday, you can't resolve value conflicts through appeal to facts alone. Effective advice increasingly relies on interdisciplinary expertise, and that's been resonated in the earlier presentations this morning, and particularly the contribution, I would argue, with regard to social scientists. It's often the case that most of the debates about scientific advice focus on the supply side, but the demand side is equally important. All advisory bodies need a realistic understanding of how policy-making processes work in government and the pressures and constraints under which politicians, their officials and decisions, and their special advisors operate. From the demand side, these are a couple of observations that one's gleaned. Policymakers seem to have, or would be described at least, maybe from a science point of view, having limited bandwidth and often limited maneuverability depending on previous policies and the electoral cycle. The policy cycle is generally short. The most relevant science that on specific issues is often incomplete and sometimes ambiguous. Policymakers cannot be expected to be scientific referees. Policymakers see scientific evidence as one of a number of inputs. From CSA experiences of colleagues in the United Kingdom, the three main things that they suggested to me that might be worth highlighting is the fact of different lenses, the approaches that different groupings, scientists and politicians and those in charge with delivering have to consider. The importance of effective communication was substantially highlighted. And then the idea of helping policymakers to solve problems, because after all, that's one of the reasons why the question was posed in the first place. So again, reiterating that scientific advice is just one part of the picture, and you can provide the best evidence, but the different lenses at work there with regard to the individuals who are requesting that information have to be considered. Finally, we must recognize that science advice is itself a field of academic study, a growing field, generating its own theories and conceptual models to explain complex relationships. And it's one of those sort of fields that I think will mature over time, so that maybe in 5 or 10 years' time, with all the different insights. Thank you very much.
Does this work? No, it doesn't. It does? No? Okay. Yes. Thanks very much. A big thanks to you, Peter, for your thoughts on how one has to approach the issue of science advice to policy in a very practical manner. I take away as before a number of issues. You talked about the timing and the urgency that need to be taken into consideration. You spoke about the importance of capacity building, both within science, but also in terms of scientific capacity on certain issues, which is also a very crucial issue. You said that one has to take into consideration the supply and also the demand side for science advice. And this is not trivial either. And you said that maybe scientists who want to provide science advice should consider themselves more like knowledge brokers and not have this idea of being able to make policy, but only to influence them, to be realistic in what they actually can achieve. And I'm sure we will take up a number of those issues later on in the discussion. Now I would like to hand over to Professor Frans Broom, who is the Council Secretary and Director of the Netherlands Scientific Council for Government Policy. He's also a Professor of Normativity of Scientific Policy Advice at Utrecht University. And Frans, you have a background in ethics and philosophy, and you have chaired since 2016 the Netherlands Society for Bioethics. The title of your talk today is Science-Based Policy Advice Needs to Take the Policy Perspective Serious. We're curious. Thanks very much.
Good morning, everybody. The Scientific Council for Government Policy in the Netherlands exists since 1972. And this council does not advise the government, the current government, but it advises on government policy, which includes, in a country where you have coalition governments, also the next government, the opposition and parliament, because you don't know who will be governing next. And since you don't know who will be governing next, it's important for science advice from our council to be linked to the broadness of policy making. And this broadness implies that we're not the science advisor of the current government. Our council consists of 8 council members, including a chair, and together they divide 3 full-time positions in time. So they really work as a council member. They are supported by a secretariat which has 18 researchers, 18 full-time job equivalents of researcher, and then some secretaries and communication staff. This together is the council, and I emphasize the word together because in the world outside of the council, both staff members and council members are seen as representatives of our council. The council is built up, exists of people with different scientific backgrounds. And when I use the word science, I use it in the translation of the Netherlands and German, Wissenschaft, which is broader than the natural sciences. We have lawyers, social scientists, economists, medical doctors, policy study people, philosophers, among our staff and in our council. For us, it's important to start where the audience is. That is, to start with the policy issues and to learn that different policy issues ask for different kinds of science advice. For example, a lot of policy decisions have their own supportive regulatory science mechanisms. Take a decision whether or not to allow a new medicine. It's regulated. There are scientific advisory mechanisms helping to take those decisions. They are not work for us. The same holds with plant protection, water management, energy, etc. There is a lot of normal policy making in which a lot of factual knowledge about the world is necessary, for which governments, at least our government, has different systems to work. Our task is to look at long-term strategic issues, issues that are not to be solved tomorrow, or maybe they should be solved tomorrow, but we know they can't be solved tomorrow, and that are for a long time on the policy agenda. In that perspective, policy making is not only short-term, there is a lot of long-term policy making going on. And we look at those long-term issues in order to advise. I'll give an example of a recent report we published. We published a report on the non-cognitive aspects of human agency. In this report, we analyzed the current state of affairs in psychology, in decision-making, theory, etc., to see that in order to persevere in decision-making, much more is necessary than knowledge. You have to make a plan. You have to work when things go wrong. You have to get out your bed every morning, etc. Open your post and all those things. All actions that are not necessarily steered by knowledge. And we learned that those abilities are not equally distributed among citizens. Some people have a lot of action power, while others are limited in their action power. And we learned that it's not distributed among the same lines as intelligence. You have very smart people with little action power and the other way around. And we learned that action power changes when, for instance, there is stress, an important life event or something like that. It diminishes. And finally we learned it cannot really be trained. You see, a lot when people come in financial problems, we can train a little bit on doing their finance, but we can't train the whole possibility to open an action thing. This created, when we were not careful, a very negative message for government. Our government has a policy of getting more responsibility to citizens, and we tell them they can't take it and you can't learn them to do so. That wouldn't work quite well. So we try to think, what can government do? Which is a very important part of science advice. Not just telling, well, this is the problem and this we know. But think along their lines what to do. And we learned that a lot of decisions can be made accordingly. We gave a few practical examples, and I'll give one here. Make sure that if you change things and give responsibility to the citizens, that they are not worse off if they do nothing. I take the pension planning as an example. We have a national big pension planning system, and one of the things many people say, people should have more say about it themselves. And we say that might be from a political or political theoretical perspective interesting, from a political ideology maybe even necessary, but be aware that many people are not able to take those responsibility for such a long-term decision. Even if they can understand, they are not having the willpower and the possibilities to act upon it. The costs for tomorrow are much more urgent than the long-term benefits they can't see today. So take that as a point of departure. We were able to make this report with a lot of different specific examples where things go wrong and things could be better. What we did, we provided government with an action perspective, which is quite important. This leads to my concluding remarks. The interdisciplinary in this study was fostered by the problem, not from the science perspective. Looking at the problem brought which disciplines were relevant, not starting with the scientific perspectives. Problems aren't disciplinary structures. The quality of our report was not just the scientific quality. Of course, no real involved scientist should be able to criticize the fundamentals of the report, so we had peer reviews and everything. But it's also about advisory quality. How do we advise in a way that they can do? The independence, it's much more than formal transparency. It's also with which stakeholders we were involved and with whom we spoke in order to get a broader picture of the problem. This issue is an example on the agenda setting. We brought it on our agenda ourselves because we thought for a long-term perspective for government this is important. We get topics asked by government, but for us it's very important that there is a mechanism that goes beyond the daily routine of policy making to open up for strategic questions. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Franz. If you allow me, I will also try to just highlight some of the things that you've just said. So you said when we want to think about interdisciplinarity, we have to think about the problems and not about starting from a science perspective, which I think is a crucial insight. You also said just when you want to identify topics, you have to go beyond the daily routine and be open for strategic issues. Look for the real issues, also with help of stakeholders. But again, when you're thinking about stakeholders, you also have to contextualize this engagement of the stakeholders. And you mentioned the notion of independence as a central notion for science advice, and that it's much bigger than what we usually understand when we talk about independence. Thanks. Now, our last speaker for this panel, Dr. Bolani, if I may introduce you as well. So, Sia is the Senior Liaison Officer at the Academy of Science of South Africa, where he is in charge of the Academy's Overseas Collaboration Sub-Program. His role there is to build new and maintain existing overseas partnerships. He previously served as researcher at the South African Council for Scientific and Industry Research, and he holds a PhD in biotechnology. And your title here is South Africa's Science Advice Landscape, the perspective of your academy.
Thank you very much, Julia, for that warm introduction. And let me start by saying good morning to everyone and thank the organizers of this conference for the invitation to participate in this panel discussion on science for policy, national perspectives. As Julia has mentioned, I will share a little bit about South Africa's science advice landscape and give you sort of what we do, sort of practical example as an academy. But when I listened to a lot of speakers yesterday, today, we sort of saying more or less the same message. But I'll try to use more examples to indicate what our role as an academy in South Africa. So in August 2014, Sir Peter Globman, Chief Scientific Advisor to the Prime Minister of New Zealand, jointly with the International Council for Science, which is ICSU, hosted and chaired a conference on science advice to governments. One of the outcomes of this meeting was a decision to further develop the international network for science advice to governments. This conference was followed by a series of international agreements that have science at their core. In March 2015, world leaders agreed on the Sendai Framework for Disaster Reduction for 2015 to 2030. In September 2015, the United Nations launched a set of 17 Sustainable Development Goals with targets for achieving by 2030. And the so-called COP21 meeting in Paris in 2015, world leaders agreed on a deal to rein in carbon emissions to tackle climate change. So the fundamental question has always been how do governments, UN bodies, and other players integrate the best science into their implementation plans to achieve one or the other of the SDGs or targets set by the Sendai Paris agreements. I'm sure that many of the academy secretariats, former presidents of academies and current presidents that are present here today can remember that ASAF, the Academy of Science of South Africa, jointly with the IAP, hosted a conference on science advice in February 2016 in South Africa. The conference explored a wide variety of themes under science advice, such as country readiness for science advice and the interplay between science advice, politics, and media, to name but few. The conference was preceded by a workshop on science advice itself that was designed specifically for academics and policymakers from Africa. It was at this workshop that INSA Africa was established with the intention to do the following: create a platform for connecting advisors with policymakers, encourage sharing of knowledge and learning, and establish common principle of developing and reporting science advice to African governments. The African Network has become an essential tool to fast-track training of scientists in a continent where science advice is very low. A desktop study that was initiated by the South African Department of Science and Technology that analyzed 19 countries in Africa, including South Africa, showed that 53% of the countries had individuals trained in SDI policy analysis and formulation, whereas 47 had no information at all. When asked if their ministries have adequately trained individuals in SDI policy analysis and formulation, 10% had adequately trained, 16% inadequately trained, and 74% had no trained individuals at all, indicating that this is not in the top agenda of many African countries. When asked what are the specific skills or development priorities for their country or ministry, 26% had priorities and 74% had no priorities at all, but just indicated that they needed to build more capacity. So the Academy of Science of South Africa, like many organizations in South Africa that are established through an act of parliament, forms part of an advisory structure that include advisory councils, advisory committees, science advisors to ministers, presidential agencies, sector-specific advisory bodies, regulatory bodies, and early warning advisory bodies. These are quite important, as in the country we have so many challenges. I mean, one of the recent challenges I can mention was an outbreak of listeria, where over 100 people died because of this listeria outbreak. And some of these bodies were quite essential in terms of their response and advising the Ministry of Department of Health as to how to deal with the issue of listeria. Over and above that, when one remembers of a recent incident of the death of over 100 mental health patients in South Africa because of simple neglect. And some of these things are things that departments can easily address, but without the engagement of civil society, it becomes very difficult. But civil society comes into play in advising government and taking government into task in terms of how they should undertake its duties. ASAF's science advisory role in support of policy development is informed by key national challenges, particularly those outlined in the country's national development plan. The Academy's strength lies in undertaking in-depth, evidence-based studies. As part of its contribution to the National Development Plan, the Academy has undertaken studies that went to inform policy in South Africa. Some of these studies include the PhD study. It's called the PhD study, an evidence-based study on how to meet demands for high-level skills in an emerging economy. The recommendation of this study now underpin South Africa's policy on how the country should address challenges of producing more PhD graduates. More recently, the South African Department of Science and Technology commissioned the Academy to undertake a study on South Africa's technical readiness to support the shale gas. The study was undertaken following intense debates in the country by many stakeholders, including business, academics, policymakers, and civil society. Some of the studies have fast-tracked response from government ministries by increasing research funding and infrastructure development. But there has been challenges when conducting joint studies with other African academies, where the topic under study is outlawed in a particular country. A study on diversity in human sexuality, implications for policy in Africa, is one of such example. The study, which was jointly done with the Ugandan National Academy of Sciences, could not be launched in Uganda, although the Academy had endorsed the study. This was due to the country's Anti-Homosexuality Act. It is safe to say that ASAF has enjoyed a somewhat positive response from the South African Department of Science and Technology in using some of the Academy's studies to inform policy. This could be as a result of the Academy's proactive approach in undertaking some of the studies that align with the country's national development plan. In addition, the independence of the Academy and the quality of its work has given it respect from many of its stakeholders. With all I have mentioned, the need for science in government remains underestimated, particularly when making economic, environmental, social, resource management decisions, especially in health, education, justice, and industrial sectors. Of course, science is not the only source of knowledge. I think that has been hammered over and over in this conference. Knowledge comes from many different sources, such as religion, dogma, and family tradition. And when this is related to science, it becomes very complicated. A bigger issue in the understanding of how politicians see something and how different scientists see the same issue. Science has many processes, and it is the processes, not the facts, that give science the privilege over any other sources of knowledge in advising government. Policy is better if it is informed by evidence and not determined by evidence. Policy is made by politicians and policymakers, and it includes other considerations such as public opinion, political ideology, and democracy by electoral contracts. I would like to conclude by saying there is a tendency to only look at natural sciences to provide input for science advice, while other areas of research are equally important. If science advice is informed by diverse sources of information, then it can respond in diverse solutions to both systematic and sector-specific challenges. The interaction between science and policy ultimately depends on trust. Without trust, science will have no impact on policy. That is why the integrity of everyone involved in this process is critical. Thank you very much.
Big thanks to you, Sofia, also for helping us to step beyond the European framework to learn about how things work in other areas of the world. As for the previous speakers, if you allow me, I'd like to highlight some of the things that you have just said. So you pointed out the importance of understanding and being open to other sources of science advice and other sources of knowledge. And you said that if science advice is informed by diverse sources of knowledge, it's even richer and can be more effective. You also highlighted something that was already stated earlier, that policy should be informed but not determined by evidence. And I found also that this was a good formulation. You highlighted the importance of capacity building in several respects. And at the very end, you came up with the importance of trust, which is also a crucial notion in the context of the things that we are discussing today. So now I would like to open the discussion, but maybe you allow me, the speakers, to ask a first question, and that links immediately to what you just said, namely trust. So how does one generate trust? How can science advisors generate the trust of policymakers to listen to what they have to say? Maybe you would like to reflect on this. Who would like to go first? Yeah?
Thank you very much. This is a very important question of trust. I mean, one of the things I would like to indicate is that actually when one looks at even how academies state, say they provide evidence-based science advice instead of providing informed science advice, that I might say is something that generally policymakers do not like. They feel that it is arrogant to take an approach that advice only comes from science without considering other aspects of other areas. Now, trust is an important issue, especially when this arrogance from scientists comes into play, when they feel strongly that what they have to say is the only way to go. So how do you go about ensuring that this trust is established? One of the ways that we have gone about at the Academy is to basically center our studies around, as I've indicated, around what the country's priorities are. And of course, some of these things, we're not doing it just for, for reaction from the government and all of that, but sort of look at long-term studies that will provide some value for their country. But while we do that, we engage government officials, policymakers, quite very early in some of our discussion, so they understand what we're doing and the reasons behind what we're doing. Of course, without trying to influence what we're doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I have a slightly different opinion, but here I'll take the opportunity to complement what you said. Because, the trust is also relevant to politicians, who trust them at the end of the day, after the elections. So, I believe that also it's different cultural mentalities, because we are talking for arrogance that we very often see, and we discuss this, in fact, in Brussels. But when I come back home, I think that, in fact, we need, and the researchers need to be more self-confident, because I'm working with a lot of young people, with pupils, and I have to tell you that they definitely trust, because they just are still innocent, so to speak, and they really trust and they really praise what researchers are doing. Opposite to politicians, opposite to journalists, they are very open to learn more. But again, at the end of the day, how we are building trust nowadays, we are losing trust in research. That's true, because just the dynamism in the world is different. The digitalization, the openness of the world, the fake news, especially the mass media, led to very variable aspects of understanding researchers. So I think, again, our responsibility of managers and researchers themselves is constantly to inform, to share what they are doing, not to become politicians, not to advise, you should do this or that. This is not the role of the researchers, but they should constantly inform and share what they are doing, and make the citizens, as you said, and the politicians make their informed choice. And the trust will come more and more. I think overall we trust in science because we love science.
I think looking at trust is looking from the wrong perspective. If I ask you, do you trust me? Trust is gone, because trust is a kind of tacit demand that's in between a relation before we thematize it. I think we should focus on trustworthiness. If we say there is not enough trust, we say the others don't trust science, it's their problem. If we say we need to work on the trustworthiness of science, it's our problem, and that's something we can do about. And if we do something about trustworthiness, I think there are two elements really relevant. One is the element of ability. One trusts someone who is able to do something. We're very good and we're hard working on that issue, and I think rightly so. But there's a second issue, and that's the issue of relevance. You trust someone who is not only able, but is doing the things you would like that are be done, who shares the values that are behind it. That's, I think, why the colleague from South Africa rightly said we work on societal important issues. Are we, when we work on the problems, really looking at the problems as they are posed, and are we serving those who have to solve these problems? If we can show that we make a difference, that we help them, that would be a part of our trustworthiness.
Thanks. I just compliment some of the other points made by other speakers. I think the importance of solving a problem, that's in some respects where the genesis of some of the requests come from, and the ability to do that in an informed way without accepting, or by accepting the fact that the decisions that are made by politicians are separate from the advice that's given. I think another aspect with regard to trust and trustworthiness is the idea of building a relationship. These people are in government for reasons that they're trying to do good for their society, and from that point of view, understanding them as people and developing a relationship where that trust and trustworthiness can be exercised, I think is a very practical aspect.
Thanks very much to the 4 speakers. Now it's time for questions from the floor. Please, if you have a question, yes, just come to the microphone and ask our speaker.
We have seen the last 2 years a dramatic shift in attitude in the United States at the highest political level towards science. The Trump administration shows a profound disrespect for facts, for knowledge, and for science, and base their decisions suddenly on other criteria. So my question to the panelists, do you think there is a risk that this will spill over also to Europe? Or do you think that European countries has the strength to continue and develop a knowledge-based policy?
Thank you. Who would like to take this question?
The risk of spillover is absolutely there. And I think we need to be aware of that risk. That's first. I agree. I think one of the issues, as far as I can see, is that science in the United States, in their political system, has been linked much more than here in Europe to one of the 2 political parties. From many research we see that it's not just the Trump administration problem. It's a long-term problem where science, scientists, academia has lost its link with the Republican Party. If that goes on a long time, I think that's a big problem. So I think we need, beyond the analysis of the facts in the decisions, also a good analysis of the life views, perspectives, and the role of facts in those with regard to the different political parties. And we need to link broader than just to the progressive half of Europe.
Peter?
Thanks. I think there's very much a threat of spillover, and I think we can't be complacent about it. But one of the things I was interested in is the Ipsos Mori poll that was mentioned yesterday. If one looks at it in terms of trust in various professions, and we took some solace with regard to scientists and professors being up there, along with nurses and doctors. But if one looks at a granular level, in fact, and breaks the data down in terms of those who have degrees and those who have no higher level sort of educational, you can actually see there's a considerable drop-off in that. So it's a reminder to us all that when we're looking at some of these issues, we can't afford to be complacent with the idea of the pervasive nature of populism.
So yeah, how do you see this discussion from Sofia?
Thank you. Although I'm not from Europe, but of course I can take this question. What the question raised is very important, but I mean the beauty about this is that science is quite universal. If Trump's attitude affected the decision making that the academies in the US were taking, then there would be even greater concern. But I think what's important here is that despite the attitude of the Trump's administration, what is important is that it moves the world into a different dimension, which is science diplomacy, which is very important, and it's sort of a buzzword in our days to engage on issues of science diplomacy. And I think this is that a time where science diplomacy takes a center stage.
Thank you. I was looking, thank you very much for the question, provocative questions. It's good, especially in the morning, to wake us up a little bit. I was looking for the tweet of the President of the Council of the European Union of yesterday. Maybe it can answer a little bit. Looking at the latest decisions of the Trump administration, someone could even think, with friends like this, who needs enemies? But frankly, you should be grateful. Thanks to him, we got rid of all illusions. We realize that if you need a helping hand, you will find it in the end of your arm. I just wanted to share this with you because rarely I like some tweets of politicians. But what I can comment on this, and it's very serious, we are very often recently hearing also explanations very often from the Commission analysis when we are trying to make a good decisions, analysis based on comparison with the states, how they're doing good, where they're doing. I think we are a little bit suffering of this self-confidence, and very often we are then asking why we should always compare only one side, only one element. For example, the investments or the innovation boost. We should compare overall the science environment, and Europe can provide a lot to the world, and especially through the science diplomacy, because we have a lot of added value there. And maybe in the long term, in fact, it will happen, I hope so, that our approach to science and innovation was with a more impactful and added value. So maybe we can now try to learn our friends from the States how to do.
Thank you. I see 2 more questions, 3 more questions. So I suggest, for the sake of time, that we ask the 3 of you to come to the microphone, ask your questions, and I'll ask the panelists to take all questions together. And maybe you briefly introduce yourself, very briefly.
Olivier Pironneau from Academy of Science in France. When you advise your government, do you try to see forecast the kind of bad things that would happen after you do your advising? Because you know that you represent one consensus, but not all consensus, and you have some people who have very different opinions, and sometimes unfounded. So do you try to see what's going to happen if with the consensus that you propose?
So a similarly related question. My name is Marion Scott and I'm from the Royal Society of Edinburgh. So Peter mentioned that you can't resolve value conflicts through appeals to facts alone. And yesterday, some of the presentations focused on reaching consensus. And in a European context, we've seen examples where, if you like, decisions and views concerning, for example, neonicotinoids and pesticides have been quite different in different parts of the European Union. So how do we resolve, if not with facts, the value conflicts? How do we strive towards consensus in our, if you like, advice to policymakers?
Was there a 3rd question? No. So who would like to go first on the implications and how to resolve value conflicts?
Yeah, that's a very important question. One of the things that I think is very useful is the convening of the multiple disciplines. So we've heard about interdisciplinarity, and I do think that the different processes and skill base that different disciplines bring provide for both the awareness of the fact that some of the solutions are beyond the derived information, but in terms of realizing there's a variety of different constituents that have to be brought together. I'm not sure that necessarily always seeks to resolve, because beliefs are very powerful and they often determine the scaffolding of our frameworks for understanding. And from that point of view, it's not always the case that the consensual aspect will actually result in some sort of final agreement. But I think one of the aspects that brings some benefit to that is the interdisciplinary approach, and bringing in particularly some of the nuances of social and cognitive neuroscience.
I'm not sure whether consensus is always something we want. Some problems are complicated in a way that advising government would already be a very helpful if we map out who has which opinion and why, this implies not only the natural science analysis of the facts and the perspectives, but also the social and historical perspectives on where the problem comes from. I'll give an example, genetically modification and food. If we want to understand the discussion about GMO food, we need to understand the role of food in different cultures. In some cultures, it's just to nourish yourself. In other cultures, the whole identity of the culture is embedded in the food. And changing that food from that perspective with a technology that's foreign says it is going to change the building blocks of life, etc., links to different value perspectives and different feelings to those who are involved, and therefore will change the different scientific perspectives of the issue. And if we do not recognize those aspects of policy problems, we will be limiting ourselves to a small technical issue that's maybe not the issue at stake for the policymaker.
Thank you. I think this brings me to something that I said in my keynote, that these are elements that we should work more, because I think the models in different, I was thinking countries, but you're correctly right that it's about more cultures or whatever communities, it's different. But, and I don't have one answer. I think the most challenging for the academies, because we don't have in Bulgaria scientific advice mechanism, but the government very often and currently establish a very cooperative model of call on the academies. So, but it's a little bit straightforward. We ask the Academy of Sciences, the president of the Basque can say more, or we ask the Academy of the Agrarian Academy on particular issues. And then yes, you are asking yourself how you can reach a consensus. Then if you advise more or different research communities, then it's very difficult. So my prescription for this is that the academies should cooperate more among themselves. They should be more open, and a kind of a model of peers, or as the other speaker said, interdisciplinarity approach should be more embedded, but also somehow external support, or open to other models in other countries. And yes, last but not least, we anyhow need, from the perspective of the academics of sciences, to think more about some kind of ex ante when we are providing this type of opinions, because very often they are very strong, they are sound, the politicians take them, but then some years later it's difficult to explain this, and it has to be always sound. Once a politician steps on this, I believe that when the next political party comes back to this, it has to be sound, it has to be there. This is very important, and this is why we're talking about excellence in research.
Thank you very much. Maybe picking up from your very last point of politicians, just to add, that remains a big issue when you have a change of government, where at times that when there's a study that has been proven to be important for the country, and you change the guard, whether it's the minister or the president, it loses focus, and whoever comes in that position sort of try to find their own thing to do. But of course in Africa we've got different sort of challenges. I was talking to Professor, I think, Owen yesterday, just indicating to her that one of our challenges is career politicians, people who have been in the system for just way too long. I'm not even talking about the president, I'm talking about the ministers that move from one ministry to the other. And some of these people become hardened So whatever advice you provide, they simply don't care, they just move on to the next ministry. So that's another dimension into this entire topic about consensus. It can be very difficult.
Okay, with this, I suggest we close our first panel. I'd like to thank my speakers very, very much for a lot of inspiring thoughts that will accompany us during the rest of the meeting. You are now cordially invited to refresh yourself, get some coffee, and we will then be back here at 11:15, and aim to resume at latest 10 to 11. So again, thanks very much.